Oh, thanks. I wonder if you could talk more about how to adapt services to broaden what they can partner with families on. I mean, certainly in my background, where I've developed clinical models and clinical pathways, it resonated with me, your comments about the barriers, some of the perceived barriers around, okay, well, that's not what our clinical model does. That's not what's in the job description. We have to worry about accreditation and wait times. I mean, those are real the perception that these are barriers is very real. And I'm interested in some of the conversations you've been having around system change and who also, in addition to you, is working on that.
Help is. So the thing that AIDP, that I came to realize that AIDP had, is what I think of it as institutional freedom to a degree. That the government said, yeah, let's slap an A on the front of IDP and off you go, do your stuff, right? Well, if AIDP had done and copied their IDP counterparts, families wouldn't have come, it wouldn't have been effective, it wouldn't be scaling up, 28 years later, right? Wouldn't still be here. They did have freedom, although, Diana said each organization that hosts the program, but workers realized that they needed to spend time. Like I spoke to one worker who spent 6 months in a community learning from community about what community were already doing. Mm-hmm. What are the existing resources? What is working? How can we fit within your community in order to do good work? Right? They had freedom to do that. And I appreciate that not everybody is going to have that freedom. But I think the first thing that happens with systems change, and one of the models, is that you also have to think about what is the knowledge that's informing the work that you're doing? Whose knowledge is it? And what kind of knowledge is it? And is there a shared understanding around the core values and the core goals of that knowledge and the assumptions that come with it, right? So in the space that we work, biomedical, Western ways of looking at early childhood development and intervention are insufficient. They're too narrow, they're too individualistic, they're too deficit-oriented. I could go on and on, right? They're not enough. We need to have a much broader knowledge starting point that's shared within an organization. At an organizational level. If you've got values and your supervisor or your manager is in a different space and doesn't have those, then changing things is going to be really tough. So having those dialogues and conversations are really important to kind of really figure out what are we doing, what do we value, what are our aspirations, right? To then think about how are we actually being responsive to what is needed rather than our own professional needs? So one of the things that I'm going to be doing, which isn't going to make me very popular, is going to be writing something around the way that professionalism gets in the way. That when we bring our professional selves, our professional language, our professional rules and regulations and all that jazz, when we bring that and we're not really conscious of it, it can get in the way of working with families who in their daily lives experience racism, dismissal, discrimination, are focused on accessing basic food and housing security, right? So it's really disrupting the knowledge and rethinking things that we've taken for granted for so long. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Yeah. Food for thought.
Food for thought.
And I think the only thing I might add to that about, we've created who we are from scratch from 1992. And some of the things that we do are the same as our mainstream colleagues, but a lot of the stuff we do is different. So I'm going to use an assessment again as an example. In our assessment tools, there's not anything much about spirituality and that connection to Mother Earth and things like that. So there's big pieces that are missed in the work that we do with children and families. And so that's perceived as not the same or not enough, when to our families, it's more. So we really have worked hard at being what the families need to be. So we're trying to be out of the box, but we work with people that are still in a box, and it's hard for them. So even though while we might be making changes or system changes or things to work with children and families, we're working with people who, by their job description, their contract, their funding, still have to work in their box. So that makes those relationships sort of difficult sometimes. So AIDP might go in and plan on to talking about child development, but all of a sudden they have to talk about food security because the check day's a week away and they have no food for supper. So we do what we need to do. We help them get to the food basket or soup kitchen or get a voucher so that they can have meat ends till the end of the week. Or we might go into the home, and for the 10th time they've phoned and tried to get a new apartment, but they keep being turned away because they sound like their dialect. So they sound native because they sound like their dialect. Oh, sorry, we just gave it away. So me knowing the systems, I phoned up the same landlord and said, do you still have that 2-bedroom apartment available? Yes, I do. And so we work with families through so many things like that aren't related to their child development at all. And then we have people saying, you're not a counselor, you're not a social worker, you're not a health worker, but it just takes another human being to work with the human being to help them with their daily needs, not just their child needs. So I showed up at that apartment building with this family and he got caught, so that's where we advocate for families till they can advocate for themselves. So pretty soon they can stand up for themselves because we're supporting them, but we're also modeling, we're mentoring, we're doing all of those things. So even though we work outside the box, we're still building relationships with folks who have a little more strictness in their boxes. But yeah, that's that relationship building piece. So I just wanted to add that as well.
And we have another question online. This might be one actually that Dr. Grace Irochi, as a psychologist, could help us answer as well. It's about standardized assessments. There's two questions. So one is, can you please speak more to how we can make standardized assessments accessible or appropriate for Indigenous children? So I want maybe the two of you to answer that. And then there's a secondary question, and this is a much bigger one, is how can psych ed reports be more appropriate for Indigenous families? I'm going to throw that perhaps over to you can do that one? Mm-hmm. Great. And then thinking of other questions, we'll keep up to this. Okay, so
AIDP, parents' experiences in the research of ASQs, which are not a standardized tool, but a screening tool that many of you will be familiar with, was described as a test, pass or fail of my parenting. Mm-hmm. So there are two things that happen when we bring assessments into the room. We bring the assessment and we bring ourselves. And so we can adapt tools. The ASQ has been adapted in Australia and Canada for Indigenous, working with Indigenous families. And so that's one side of the thing, is the use of a standardized tool that hasn't been developed or normed involving any Indigenous children at all. There's that aspect, but there's also the aspect of the relational process of how a screening takes place and the benefits of why you would do a standardized assessment. So I'm having increasing conversations recently in a study with early intervention providers around the province around what are the benefits, why are you doing a standardized assessment? And how is that going to benefit the family? How are you involving the family? And then how are you writing that report? Whether it's a psychoed report or an SLP report or any kind of report, how are you writing it in a way that benefits a family? in a different study in northern BC that I'm still working on, I interviewed Indigenous parents in Prince George and Prince Rupert that had accessed early intervention therapy services. From their stories and experiences, it was really insightful around the experience of going through an assessment process, of being told that you are the expert on your child, and being asked all these questions. But when the report comes out, or as one parent described it, the book that they wrote about my son, in that book, the parents' voices, their views, their knowledge, their expertise is not in there at all. And what's in there is often a lot of words and language that it's questionable who it's written for, particularly if a parent can't understand it. Mm-hmm. I totally have worked with parents as an OT to write reports in order to access funding and to work the system. And I do it in a very transparent way. We're doing this report, we're going to write it like this because we need to do it in order to get this funding. Is that okay with you? Are you all right with that? But I really think one of the things that came up through AIDP was the need. They called it deferring their ECD agenda. That's what that was the theme that came through. And what deferring their ECD agenda meant was actually deferring ASQ screening, because that was not what the parents needed, and that wasn't going to benefit a parent at that time. Sometimes they did it later, sometimes they didn't. So I really think we have to rethink, why are we doing standardized assessments? How are they benefiting families? And please don't do assessments to help you with your own clinical reasoning if you're an early intervention therapist. And don't put your professional agenda into that report, right? Put it aside. Write a report that a family can use and benefit from. So as you can tell, I have strong views on this because it gets me going. It's one of those triggers like standardized assessments. We need to just rethink completely what we're doing, in my opinion.
Right. And I've been around long enough. Some of you who are my age, I'm not sure how many that might be in this room. We used to use the Denver Developmental Screening Tool, and then we used the Gazelle for years. And I was never a fan of either of those, but if we were asked by a pediatrician or social worker to do an assessment, those are the tools we used. And I was never comfortable using them, but I would do them if it helped further referrals to other services if they needed a diagnosis or they needed more supports. Right today, AIDP, they only use the ASQ and the ASQ SE, which is a screening tool, but we don't do it automatically. We don't do it as part of our whole plan with that family. If we see something, if parents have questions, if it was a referral, we talk to the referral source, and if they want one, we might do it, but we're not going to do it on visit 1 or visit 2. Again, that's that relationship building. We might not do it for 6 or 7 or 8 visits. Again, that's where we get some criticism, and is that, well, IDP gets it to us in 3 weeks, and I'm sorry, we haven't even established a relationship yet of trust. So when we talk about standardized tests, I don't talk about the test. I talk about the relationship between the person who administers the test, the family, the purpose of the test, what the outcome of the test is going to be. And I, early on in my career, when we started talking about the different tools, and we should have our own tool, we should have an Indigenous tool. And I kind of thought even that would be difficult because we have 203 First Nations in BC. We have so many dialects and then so many subdialects, and then we have geographical differences. I'm Coast Salish, so I get my food from the ocean, and other in Northeast eat moose, and I don't. And there's so many differences in territory, nations, languages, geography, food, that I thought, how do we standardize a test for Indigenous children? I just didn't know how that could happen. And then I kind of thought, well, wherever you are in the world, development is sequential and cumulative. So just find the best tool that fits, and then adapt it. So you can't necessarily adapt tools, but I adapt how I administer the tool and what I use. I usually bring my my bags with me, but I didn't today because we weren't talking about it specifically. But I have my own bag of tools when I do visits. And like I said, one is a baby in a cradle board, a brown baby in a cradle board, and a brown doll wearing kwakwakwa regalia with a button blanket. I mentioned my dad carved me a canoe. I bring eagle feathers. I bring a cedar basket. A totem pole, a drum. And so that's how I indigenize, and a screening tool, not a standardized tool, because you get the same information from it. And the children and families need to see themselves in the work you do. So that's how I do it. I've got 2 bags and I bring them with me everywhere I go. I almost brought it today, but I changed my mind. So that's how I make it appropriate when I have to. And yes, some people have adapted the ASQ. I know the Mi'kmaq folks from Montreal have created something, and then the Seal people in the Okanagan have also done something with the ASQ that makes it appropriate for their community. But yes, we don't do assessment just to do assessment. That's not on our plan at all unless it needs to be in partnership with the family. So I can't answer that question directly, but I can answer it with what we do and how we use it.